In terms of the Middle East, as a region, we're talking about the area from, I guess, Egypt in the far northeastern corner of Africa, through the Levant countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and then into the Gulf, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other countries, right across to Iran. On the sort of eastern side, bordering sort of Asia, Central Asia, and the southern borders of Europe. So a large area, 20 plus jurisdictions, including sort of jurisdictions within jurisdictions, which we'll get to soon enough. A mix of legal systems, common law, civil law, probably mostly civil law at a national level, usually derived from the French Civil Code and the Egyptian civil law. And some hybrid systems, some sort of mixes of common law and civil law. Some of the wealthiest countries in the world by certain measures, and perhaps we're looking at Yemen, certainly one of the poorest as well. Some very large countries, Egypt at 106 million people, Iran's very large as well, and some of the least populous as well, down in sort of a million or so in Bahrain. A wide range of working languages, mostly Arabic is usually the sort of official language of most of the countries in the region, with the exception of Iran, which will be Farsi, and Hebrew in Israel. But you also have a wide number of English speakers, particularly in the Gulf countries. Most of the business operations there tend to be dual language to an extent.
So I just say that in Israel the two official languages are in Hebrew and Arabic, and all official documents in those two languages. I think in English as well quite often.
Yeah, and then in places like Lebanon you'll have it in French language as well. And I think that the sort of final point I made there on the slide is we have a number of economic free zones. Some of those are sort of port zones, port-free zones for import-exports. But perhaps of more immediate interest to data privacy lawyers will be the financial free zones. Dubai International Financial Centre was mentioned earlier as one of the priority data partnership jurisdictions for the UK. You also got Abu Dhabi Global Market just down the road and Qatar Financial Centre. So 3 jurisdictions housing a lot of the world's sort of largest financial institutions. They're important because they have their own regulatory systems, usually based, well, all 3 of those based on English common law. And in fact, ADGM does adopt English common law with some adaptations. And they've all passed data protection laws within those jurisdictions that are separate to the national laws. In terms of how we're seeing laws develop, I think it's on a scale really in the Middle East. And when I started working out there more than 10 years, about 15 years ago, there wasn't really much in the way of national, what we would see as a data protection law. But in most countries, there was a sense of privacy. There was an understanding of the importance of rights to privacy. And there were privacy and confidentiality concepts in things like the national constitutions and penal codes. Criminal laws would often criminalize, for example, the disclosure of secrets or information about a person's private life. And so very basic concepts, difficult to align with sort of more advanced data protection law concepts. There was no real sort of granularity around those very broad concepts, and they weren't really designed for sort of corporate data processing activities. So we had quite a few grey areas and quite a bit of advice that we had to give, which didn't often please counsel in places like the US in particular. They're not very forgiving of some of the advice that we had to, we're forced to give them. As we have progressed, as the region has progressed, and in the absence of national data protection laws, we've seen a lot of sector-driven regulation. So the financial sector, the telecom sector, the healthcare sectors in different countries have taken it upon themselves to regulate data to an extent, or specific types of data, including in some cases personal data. Or there's been regulation of specific technologies. So there's a lot of IoT regulation in the region, Internet of Things, cloud, and now increasingly other new technologies, blockchain and AI. Then most of the countries now, in fact, I think every country in the region will have a sort of separate cybercrime law, separate to the sort of general penal codes, regulating cybercrimes, computer misuse. They will often as well stray into sort of data protection type obligations or provisions that regulate or criminalize certain data processing actions. And then finally, I think, we have started to see, and really it's been over the last 4 years or so, this sort of push post-GDPR, the sort of ripples from GDPR in Europe, stretching around the world, as we know. And we've seen a lot of regulators and governments interested in regulating data at a national level. And that's not to say they necessarily do it in the same way as the GDPR. A lot of them have been inspired by GDPR. But I think it's important to know that the drivers for regulating personal data from governments in the Middle East are not always, in fact, they're rarely the same as the European drivers. So we don't have, I don't think Middle East governments are particularly focused on protection of sort of consumers or the sort of human rights aspect of privacy. They are concerned about data as a commodity, as a national security issue. And so a lot of the regulation is focused around protection of data from a security perspective. And you see sort of threads of national security through the laws. So in Egypt, for example, it looks like GDPR in places, but also you see things talking about national security much more than you do in European legislation. And that flows through to some of the offences. So there are criminal offences in Egypt's law, in Bahrain's law, in the Saudi law, which criminalise certain actions, so disclosure of data without consent or export of data in particular, will often be punishable by as a criminal offence, so imprisonment or fines for individuals.